All right, let's kick it off. Hi, everyone. The topic right now is integrating remote sensing data sets for accurate, high-resolution forest carbon accounting. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Max Joseph, who's a data scientist at NCX, working to connect every American forest landowner to net zero pioneers. His doctoral training was in quantitative ecology, and he earned an undergraduate degree in wildlife biology. So that's fascinating, Max. Using Bayesian hierarchical models and deep learning, Max develops probabilistic models of forest carbon and deforestation using Earth observation data from diverse sensors. NCX maintains a high-resolution map of the forests of the United States to underpin forest carbon marketplace. And NCX's work has focused on transitioning this from an annual data product to a quarterly updated data set, testing the integration and combination of many machine learning techniques. And I think today, Max, you are going to cover all of this work, also present some successes, failures, your journey, and the relative impacts of these different processing remote sensing data using different models. So again, very happy to have you. Over to you if you want to start sharing your screen, and we'll get this kicked off.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Great. All right. So yes, today I'll be talking about integrating remote sensing data for forest carbon accounting, how we do it at NCX, some of the things that we've found really useful, some of the challenges that we've faced. And let's kick it off with a graph that you've all probably seen. It should come as no surprise that we are in a critical decade for climate action. In order to curb greenhouse gas emissions, we want to use all tools at our disposal, including reducing those emissions and removing carbon from the atmosphere. Now, as part of that, we know that we need to deploy natural climate solutions. We expect that by 2030, natural climate solutions can provide about a third of the reductions that we need to stabilize warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. One of the central ideas at NCX is that improved forest management can increase carbon sequestration. And this is true in part because trees convert carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into biomass, right? So in particular, they convert it into wood and leaves, and this is happening all of the time as trees grow. In order to use this as a tool to remove carbon from the atmosphere, what we would like to do is increase the amount of carbon that is being sequestered from the atmosphere into forests. So how do we do that? Well, the first step is to think about who owns forests, who's on the hook for actually making management decisions that could increase sequestration. This is a map of forest ownership across the United States, and the largest chunk, just by area, of forest ownership corresponds to private families, this sort of big green chunk of this pie chart. And this is especially true in the eastern US. In the western US, the majority of forest land is owned by the federal government. And at NCX, we really want to enable private families to participate in our program to increase carbon sequestration on their properties. But by targeting private family forest owners, there are some special considerations, right? So traditional or legacy forest carbon projects have some constraints that can prevent private family forest owners from participating. In particular, exceptionally long contracts, in some cases, contracts that last for 100 years. If you are a private family forest owner and you engage in one of those contracts, you're essentially committing to some course of action for the rest of your life, and you're also committing subsequent generations to that course of action based on what we know today, but a lot can change in 100 years. So those long contracts tend to be less appealing to private families. Another constraint has been the minimum area requirements to participate in improved forest management projects. A lot of these private families don't own a lot of land, and so they may not even qualify for certain programs. But at NCX, we want to enable them to be a part of natural climate solutions. So what we do is we credit timber harvest deferrals to increase carbon sequestration. In other words, if a forest is going to be cut, we credit somebody for not cutting that forest. And in doing so, they've increased the carbon sequestration for some amount of time on their land. And there are essentially 3 steps to do this. First, we estimate the carbon at risk for every forest acre in the US. And carbon at risk here is how much carbon do we expect to be removed under a business as usual scenario. If you're a landowner, you can sign up and get a free report to see how eligible you are, how many potential credits you may have access to, given your land, given the forests that you can manage. Second, we run a marketplace where landowners can bid to decide to defer all or maybe some fraction of the harvests that they plan on their land for 1 year. And this 1-year program is in stark contrast to, for instance, a 100-year program. And then finally, if a landowner actually decides to participate and defer harvest, we monitor and audit their land to ensure that they indeed have deferred harvest. And then if they do that, they get paid at the end of that 1-year period for essentially doing nothing, right? So for not cutting the forest that they would have cut otherwise. One of the key ideas here is that we want to generate additional carbon on the landscape. This is carbon that exists because of their participation in the program. It would not have existed otherwise. And if you look at, for instance, a satellite image, this is collected near the Mississippi-Louisiana border. It's not obvious, how much of this carbon is additional. You need some extra bits of information to know how much of the carbon exists because they've participated in our program. And so the framework that we use for quantifying additional carbon relies on measuring carbon over time. So here's a graph, times on the x-axis, carbon on the y-axis. If a landowner decides to participate, we can quantify how much forest carbon they have in their property at the beginning of that 1-year performance period. We'll call this T0 or time 0. We can predict 1 year into the future how much carbon would be there if the landowner didn't participate, if they were just going about business as usual conditions. And this baseline prediction incorporates information about the exact kinds of forests they have on their properties, how much value they could derive from cutting those forests, the mill pressure, how many wood mills are there nearby that would actually purchase the timber that they would cut, as well as how expensive it would be to actually harvest. So some forests are much more expensive to harvest than others. For example, if they're far from roads or if they're in really rugged terrain. So we combine all of that information into a model and forecast 1 year out how much carbon might there be if this landowner was just going about business as usual and not participating. If they do participate, then we can measure how much carbon is actually there at the end of that 1 year period. We'll call this T1 carbon. And the difference between T1 carbon and the predicted baseline carbon is additional carbon. That's what we want to create on the landscape. That's what we want to encourage landowners to generate. That's what we want to credit. Pretty simple, right? Well, maybe not, right? So part of the problem here is that directly measuring forest carbon is hard. In order to really measure forest carbon, to observe it, you would have to go out to a forest, cut down every single tree and stem. This is just above ground biomass. Dissect those trees, cut them up into their constituent parts, dry those constituent parts in a literal oven until all of the water weight is gone, and then weigh the dried pieces so that you can quantify how much biomass is there. So this is labor intensive. It doesn't scale very well. And most importantly, it is the complete opposite of what we would like to do, right? We're trying to get people to defer harvest. And so harvesting just to quantify carbon just doesn't make sense. Fortunately, we know quite a bit about how to estimate the amount of carbon in individual trees. And in particular, we rely heavily on allometric relationships. In other words, relationships between, say, the diameter of a tree's trunk and the amount of carbon in that tree. These relationships are quite well documented. They vary by species, they vary by location. But at the end of the day, if you can observe the diameter of a tree, which is relatively easy to do, right? You just wrap a tape around the tree's stem. If you can do that, then you can predict biomass fairly well. Okay, so great, we can do that. All we have to do is go out and identify the trees to the species level, wrap a tape around them, and then Bob's your uncle, we have estimates of biomass. But the problem with that, well, there are a few problems with that. One, there are a lot of trees, so it's not really practical to send people out to measure every single tree in an area. And two, going out and actually doing this is hard, right? So this is an example of an observer measuring diameter at breast height of a tree, but there's snow. So he's got to actually get down and try to estimate where is the actual breast height at that tree. So we can't rely exclusively on ground measurements and allometric relationships to get good estimates of carbon. Modern approaches rely on a combination then of remote sensing data and field data in order to support carbon accounting. So this is an image, it's a colored LiDAR point cloud from one of the National Ecological Observatory Network sites, dominated by pine trees. You can see the signatures of individual trees here. And if we were all tasked with estimating the amount of above ground biomass for this particular forest, and we had a budget, say, to allocate 20 ground plots where we go and send field observers to 20 different locations, you could imagine collecting those data and then building a model that links the ground observations to what we see in the remote sensing data. And if you predict using that model, you might have a better shot at actually quantifying the total amount of carbon in this forest. And at a high level, that's essentially what we are trying to do, except at a continental scale. Okay, so here's the graph that we saw before. I'm going to talk first about some of the details of how we estimate initial carbon for properties that are enrolled in our program. And there are two ingredients to these carbon estimates. The first is a product that we generate called BASEMAP, and the second is field data that we collect to improve the estimates from BASEMAP. At its core, BASEMAP is a map of forest structure. And what I mean by forest structure is how many stems are on the landscape, what are their species identities, what species of trees do they have, and how big are each of those trees. And this is a model that we deploy at a 30-meter spatial resolution across all forests in the conterminous United States. So what's unique about BASEMAP? There are a lot of carbon maps that have been generated, but BASEMAP is unique in two senses. First, it is literally a map of stems, right? So we are not just predicting carbon at the pixel level, we're predicting species composition, the size distribution, et cetera. And that unlocks carbon estimates, but it also unlocks other estimates, say of species richness, merchantable value, et cetera. Second, and this is the part that, you know, as a data scientist and a statistician makes me the most excited, is this is a fully Bayesian model. So we have the full posterior distribution for all of the quantities that we predict for every pixel for an entire continent, which is just to say we have full predictive uncertainty out of the model. So at a really high level, we ingest a stack of predictors, combine it with some high quality forest inventory data, stir it together in a model. And this model is comprised of an observation model, which formalizes the relationship between the data that's collected and the actual likelihood of the model. Underneath that observation model, there's an ecological model, which represents our beliefs about what species are present, what their size distributions are, et cetera. And then at the bottom level, since this is a hierarchical Bayesian model, there are prior distributions. Like, what are our prior beliefs about the parameters before having observed the field inventory data? From that model, we can then predict BASEMAP and then use that as part of our carbon accounting. To drill down a little bit deeper, the predictors that we're currently using are derived from Sentinel-2 imagery, as well as previously published land cover layers, climate data, and ecoregion boundaries, which give you some indication for the kinds of species that you expect to see across the landscape. And the ground measurements that we're using are derived from forest inventory data, and specifically they include observations of how many trees are there, how big each tree is, and what the species identity of each tree is. So the really cool thing here is, we can make predictions from this model, and for any particular pixel, we get many posterior draws, and each draw represents a possible forest in that pixel. This is useful for a variety of reasons. One, we just get a good estimate of uncertainty in carbon, and we believe that that is incredibly important because there is going to be uncertainty in carbon estimates, especially when you're working at continental scales with limited data. Additionally, it's handy to have that full posterior distribution, because then you can compute any summary statistics that you like an expected value, or in some circumstances, it can be useful to know what is the probability that the amount of carbon exceeds some threshold. So if we sort of imagine this image of BASEMAP, which we often show, it's just a map, but that's mostly for visualization purposes. What we're really looking at here is a map of posterior medians. But we could reimagine this as a cube, right, where we still have these X and Y spatial dimensions, but now there's an additional dimension of draw. These are samples from the posterior distribution of the model. And if we were to drill down into one pixel, we would have many potential draws of carbon in that pixel, and we could then derive a posterior distribution of carbon for the pixel. It would be a little bit naive to rely exclusively on remote sensing data for carbon accounting from our perspective. So we additionally invest heavily in designing and carrying out ground samples based on our BASENAP estimates, where we can recalibrate our model using data from the properties that are actually participating in our program. And in doing so, we can be confident that the estimates of carbon that we're transacting upon are high quality and precise, and they reflect the population of landowners that we're actually working with. Okay, so that's BASEMAP and field data for T0 carbon. This is all just to get this initial estimate of carbon at the beginning of our 1-year performance period. I want to talk a little bit about things we found useful, things that we found challenging, just because not everybody at this conference is interested in forest carbon, but I hope that these tips will be more broadly applicable. One really cool thing that we discovered here is there's a lot of prior information about tree size distributions that we initially weren't using, but we decided we could use and should use. So part of BASEMAP is a tree size model. We have a size distribution of trees that varies in space. And the upper tail of that distribution, the really big trees, it turns out that we have a lot of information about exceptionally large trees across the whole globe, right? So this is one example. It's a giant sequoia, the General Grant tree. And we actually use what we know about the largest trees in the world to inform the upper tail of our tree size distribution. And in doing so, we can improve our estimates, not just of the large trees, but also of the small and medium-sized trees. And this guards against sort of outlandish predictions of tree sizes that are larger than anything that has been observed before. Another thing that we've found very useful that seems like a common theme in the talks that I've seen so far is we invest pretty heavily in ML ops. Every time we run a model, we treat that as an experiment that we're running in ML flow. logging an ML flow and linking to a model registry. So the framework here is you've got an experiment. When it starts, you log parameters and metadata of the experiment. This is intended to capture, what is it that you are trying with the model? We then run either optimization, or in this case, an MCMC algorithm to train the model. And then once the model is trained, we log a variety of metrics. And then we can log the artifacts, like the serialized model object. We also generate HTML reports of model performance that provide a lot of really rich graphical diagnostics. And we can always go back to those experiments and track how models have changed over time. One of the examples from those HTML reports is a graphical posterior predictive check. So it's important to get the size distribution of trees right if you're really going to get a good estimate of carbon. This was an example of a model that didn't get it right. Okay, so the x-axis in this plot is diameter at breast height, how big around is the tree essentially, and then count. So this is a distribution of sizes. The black dots are empirical data. The gray bars represent the model predictions. And you can see in this case, we've got a pretty adequate fit for the large trees, but this model is not really doing a very good job at predicting the small or medium-sized trees. So this is really useful to look at and to understand the failure modes of your models. So those are things that we found useful. Some of the challenges, I'm not going to lie, building Bayesian models at scale is not always a picnic. So the output from this model, if we think about it as an array, if we had just point estimates, there are about 3 billion forested pixels in our AOI. I'm simplifying to 100 tree species, but in reality, there are more. And for every pixel and tree species combination, we save 6 parameters. So if we just had point estimates, we'd be slinging a 3D array with about 1.8 trillion elements. Big, but not, totally unworkable. If we're using a Bayesian model, and if we're working with posterior samples, we have to add a dimension to that array. And this is a dimension corresponding to those posterior draws. And suppose we want to use 1,000, which is a common number to use. We would then move from 1.8 trillion to 1.8 quadrillion elements in that array, which does introduce some challenges both on the compute and storage side. Another thing that is challenging operationally for these kinds of applications is Bayesian updating. Say we get some additional data and we want to use that to update the model, or say we want to take the posterior distribution from one model and use it as a prior in some other model. I showed this scatter plot earlier of how we recalibrate our carbon estimates using really high quality ground samples, but I left out the fact that we actually have uncertainty in both directions here, and confronting that uncertainty with anything but really trivial like coin flip models tends to be quite hard. And in particular, it's hard to really retain the geometry of the posterior when you're doing this. It's pretty easy if you're just retaining the marginal posterior distributions. But this is something that we do find challenging from time to time. And then finally, tree species identification. Even in the US, there are instances where field crews go out and they can't identify tree species with certainty. And we need that species information in order to lean on the allometric relationships, like given the size of the stem, how much carbon is there. But the US doesn't have that many tree species. And so we're in some sense operating in easy mode in the US. And if we think about how do we expand these kinds of approaches to, say, the tropics, where there's more biomass and many more species, we may need to come up with some new approaches that are less reliant on species-specific identifications and relationships. Okay, so that's BASEMAP and field data and how we estimate T0 carbon. I want to talk a little bit now about how we monitor landowner performance. The people who are participating in our program sign a contract saying they will not harvest some amount on their land, but we need a way to verify that's true, right? We want to make sure they're holding up their end of the bargain. And so how do we do that? Well, remote sensing data provides an extremely powerful tool for detecting forest losses. This is not new. There's a whole body of research around this. This is an animated GIF of Southern Oregon. This is like Eccles County, which is a county that is dominated by southern pine plantations. And this is a Landsat time lapse that goes all the way back to the 1980s. And you can see in this GIF a pattern of clear cutting, replanting, thinning, and then when the trees are big enough to be harvested, they are clear cut again. And I really like this GIF because you can see sort of the patchwork mosaic as it evolves over time. And so we know that Landsat and Sentinel-2 and JEDI provide information on deforestation, but how do we actually predict losses with confidence in a way that it supports carbon accounting? Well, traditional methods typically classify at the pixel level using some historical data, which provides an expectation of what you should see, and they compare those historical data to what you do see. So this plot has time on the x-axis and a vegetation greenness index on the y-axis. And they're trying to identify losses within this gray time period, essentially the last year of the time series. So the way that this is done often is you train some cyclic model based on the historical data, and that provides you with expectations in your monitoring period, shown here as these dashed blue lines. You can then compare what you expect to see to what you actually do see, the observations in red in the monitoring period. And you can quantify the deviations between what you expect and what you see, and use those deviations to come to some classification of whether there was a loss or not. So these top two rows here are pixels where there were losses of forest. You can see that this vegetation index drops pretty far below what you would expect just based on the historical pattern. The bottom row here is an example where there was not a loss. So there's still some deviation between the observations and the expectations, but it's not a dramatic and systematic reduction in vegetation greenness. So these approaches actually work fairly well, but they do require that you come up with some good ideas for, like, what's your parametric model to represent your historical expectations? What's your measure of deviance between the observations and those predictions? And then how do you go from your measure of deviance to some classification of observing a loss or not? So at the end of the day, this is really just in service of classifying a time series. And so at NCX, we sort of tried to get rid of some of that complexity and just frame this as a time series classification model. If you caught Sam Barrett's last talk, this is pretty similar, and I was excited to see his work on transformers. But the general idea here is that there's been a lot of progress in the last few years on using deep learning for time series classification, where you can input a multivariate time series, like a satellite image time series, where the dimensions correspond to different bands or different features that you've computed from the bands. And then at the end of your model, you get some vector of class probabilities that can tell you, what's the chance that this pixel was disturbed or not disturbed, etc. So that's the approach that we lean on heavily at NCX. And just to give an example here, we like to split out not just disturbances and not disturbances, but a total loss of forest, for instance, from a clear cut, and a partial loss of forest that could be from selective thinning. This is a raster of some example output. The black pixels are pixels with no loss. The bright red pixels are clear cuts. And then these big green blotches, those represent partial harvests. This is from a southern pine plantation, I believe in Alabama. And it's common practice there to every now and then thin your crops, maybe removing every nth row of trees to allow the remaining trees to grow larger and more valuable. So we treat this essentially just as a multi-class time series classification problem. And it works pretty well. So like the macro F1 of our current production model is around 0.93. Obviously room for improvement here, but better than some really simple baselines that we started with. And notably, the classes that tend to get confused are no loss and partial loss, and total loss and partial loss. It's rare that we actually have no losses that are classified as total loss, etc. So this classifier, it outputs a simplex of class probabilities. It's a vector of length 3, where if you summed all the probabilities, you would get 1 out. But this alone is not really enough for us to transact upon, right? We need some value that is meaningful in terms of carbon. So what we do is we train this classifier, we deploy it, we do some density estimation on the output in this simplex, design a field sample so that we can go out and actually observe how much carbon was removed on the landscape, and then link those observations to the output from this model. And in so doing, we can then map this simplex to the quantity that we really want, which is the fraction of carbon removed on the landscape. And so here, if the model is highly confident that there's been a total loss, we expect that all of the carbon has been removed. If the model is highly confident there's been a partial loss, we expect that maybe half to 3/4 of the carbon has been removed. And similarly, confident no loss, probably not much carbon removed. Some things we found useful here are cloud native workflows. We're churning through really high volumes of satellite imagery, which is stored in the AWS cloud as cloud optimized geotiffs. We can read those quite easily using Xarray and Dask, parallelizing over local machines and also across machines. And at the end of the day, we generate our own cloud optimized geotiffs. So this whole pipeline is cloud optimized geotiffs in, cloud optimized geotiffs out, which makes it work well and integrate with our other systems. Another thing we found useful is starting with really simple baselines, right? So the first thing we did is we constructed these NDVI time series and manually engineered some features that we thought might be important. So the x-axis here is date, the y-axis is the vegetation index. The top row, these are pixels that have not had any losses. The middle row are pixels with thinnings, and the bottom row are pixels with clear cuts. And so we looked at these time series and we thought, oh, well, what features might we engineer just off the top of our heads? And one thing that we did was like, okay, maybe the minimum vegetation index during the monitoring period could be a feature, and the minimum vegetation index during the historical period could be a feature. We came up with some other features, plugged it all into a really easy to deploy classifier framework like XGBoost, and that gave us an F1 score of around 0.8. So that was useful because we knew that any increase in performance over that is an increase over the baseline, and that gives us like some frame of reference to know how well are we doing versus a really simple naive approach. The last thing we found useful here is active learning, and in particular, we're using uncertainty sampling to be really efficient with how we actually label data and where we label data. So we prioritize labeling the pixels for which the model is most uncertain or most confused about. There's probably not going to be much value added in labeling pixels that the model is already confident and correct in its classifications. Some things that are hard about change detection are clouds. This is a mosaic I made in March over part of northern New Hampshire. And actually the March imagery looks great. And then if you want to look at the next month, this is April, where these black blotches represent invalid pixels or clouds. And you can even still see there are some cloud artifacts like shadows that are not being masked out. And so in exceptionally cloudy regions, change detection is harder than in less cloudy regions. No surprises there. Another thing that we found challenging is grappling with how much temporal versus spatiotemporal information to use. So a lot of these historical approaches treat it as a time series classification model, applied pixel by pixel independently. But we know when we look at an image like this and we're observing changes through time that our brains are using the spatial context to try to interpret what is happening, right? And so we've been exploring ways to basically use the time information as well as capture relevant spatial context so that we can get the best and most spatially coherent estimates out that we can. And then finally, this one was actually a surprising challenge, but when you go out to the field to try to quantify the fraction of carbon that's been removed, it's non-trivial, right? So here's an example of a field of stumps on the left. And ground observers are tasked with trying to identify the amount of carbon in stems that have been cut. The challenge here is you can't measure diameter at breast height because the stumps are lower than that. And furthermore, they need to be able to distinguish between stumps that were cut in the last year and stumps that were cut prior to that. But of course, it's extremely hard to say that a stump was cut 11 months ago versus 13 months ago. And so what we've been looking into is equipping these ground observers with imagery assets so they can go into the field as well as observe the time series of imagery over the past couple of years. Another challenge is not all forest losses happen because of harvests. There are wildfires, wind blowdown events. This is an image from 1962 of a pretty big wind blowdown in Oregon. And we can't realistically expect a ground observer to go to a ground plot like this, identify every stump, quantify diameter at breast height, and give us a quality estimate of the amount of fraction carbon removed without actually putting their life at risk. So I want to zoom out a little bit and just say that, you know, carbon accounting is extremely important. It's not just forest carbon, but carbon accounting more broadly is important, and it requires trustworthy models. I really love this paper towards the taxonomy of trust for probabilistic machine learning. I think it'd be broadly useful to a lot of the folks here. And it essentially describes links in the chain of trusts where trust can break down in a model. And at NCX, we look at each of these links and have systems in place to try to maximize our confidence that the models are good enough for us to transact upon. But good models are really just like one key ingredient to carbon accounting and to climate solutions, right? There's a lot of work going on at our company and other companies at reaching out to landowners, making sure they have the information that they need to make informed decisions, linking them to buyers, running the actual marketplace, etc. So I want to make sure that we're all thinking not just about the models, but how it fits into the broader business as a whole. Thanks. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you so much, Max. This is really important work, and I have to say thank you for connecting that thread. You know, starting with the landowners, the species identification, carbon measurements. Really enjoyed even learning about, you know, the cloud optimizations, all kinds of challenges, and even more importantly, some of the human aspects, right, around trust and other things. So thank you. I just have a couple of questions. I saw maybe a few references to the sources of data sets that you all use, maybe NOAA, maybe obviously LiDAR, satellite imagery. I was curious, like, was that a limiting factor, and are those data sets able to support analysis for something as complex, like you mentioned, you know, tropical rainforests and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do lean on a lot of different remote sensing data products, including Sentinel-2 as well as Landsat.
Mm-hmm.
Some of our more recent work has been working to integrate JEDI LiDAR data.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there are non-trivial challenges associated with harmonizing all of these different data sets. So that's where a lot of the work is really operationally, is accessing the data, integrating it in a way that we can deploy it in some consistent fashion across space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. I was also curious, you know, I mean, apart from some of the use cases around the total loss, no loss, partial loss, or just looking at it more from a carbon measurement standpoint, given all the complex analysis that you do, were there any other adjacent use cases or applications that maybe just emerged out of this work, and you were like, oh, maybe we could apply this to, you know, problem Y that we had never thought of?
Yeah, yes, there absolutely are. And that is one of the things that is unique to having a STEM model, to having a model of which tree species are there and what the actual size distribution is. So it turns out that, you know, for wildlife species, for example, those details can be extremely important. So one of the things that we're looking at is, you know, can we assign, you know, can we generate some data products that reflect habitat suitability for wildlife species of interest that build on top of BASEMAP, that build on top of some of the other work that we're already doing to support carbon sequestration.
All right. Switching gears a little bit, you know, there might be our listeners here, or once, you know, this is recorded and published, there might be others who are younger professionals trying to sort of get into this sector, right? Any advice to them in terms of some of the maybe key resources? How should they approach this? There are obviously a lot of interesting challenges and technologies. So where should one start?
Yeah, that's a great question. My perspective is that it is incredibly useful to have specific projects that you've worked on. It's one thing to try to go out and learn Earth data science, to learn cloud native geospatial workflows. But I think that can actually be much harder than working on a specific problem, right? So I would encourage folks who are looking to make that transition to identify some problem, even if it's just looking at a Kaggle competition, to give you some really focused use case where you will still build those other skills, but for the sake of solving a problem, instead of just for the sake of learning them. And I think in doing so, you're going to be able to better equip yourself to actually operate in an industry setting where we are trying to solve problems. Like, you know, I'm not getting paid just to build fun models, right? We're getting paid to solve climate problems, and so that's where I would start if I was looking.
Right. I couldn't agree more. I mean, you know, there is an applied side to everything, and given the sense of urgency around combating climate, I mean, that only, you know, I think amplifies that, right? And that's the way to just get that real world experience. And speaking of interesting projects, I have to ask you, are you guys hiring? Is there you know, opportunities for folks to maybe look at your website, apply? Any words of advice there?
Yeah. I believe we are. Check it out. I think it's ncx.com/careers. Yeah, I would encourage you to go to our website and see what you can find. We love to bring on new talent.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks again. Fascinating, and appreciate you joining us today. And after the break, we'll have additional sessions and we'll wrap it up with a land panel. Hope, Max, maybe you can stay on for that. That might be of particular interest to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.